Whether we call it the Russian war on Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russia-Ukraine war, amongst many other possibilities, the fact is that the situation that prevails in Ukraine translates well where the world stands from many key issues. War, the system of international relations, and security in general lie at the heart of this crisis. So, despite appearances, the world is divided over whether it has to officially condemn Russia for its action in Ukraine or to accept it. Legally speaking, Russia's invasion of Ukraine cannot be accepted. It is a breach of international law. At the same time, international law often happens to be abused by countries, starting with the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, who have the power to veto any resolution that they don't want. This is why Ukraine has been the object of a resolution that was adopted in early March 2022 in the General Assembly of the UN, rather than the object of a Security Council resolution. So, looking at things from a broader perspective, and though the war is not yet behind us, there are some lessons that can be drawn from Ukraine, and here are some of the main points. First, when it comes to the international dimension, it looks like we have not overcome the Cold War mentality. Indeed, back in the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, with the end of the Cold War approaching at that time, many theories got their momentum. Among these, the end of history, where Francis Fukuyama considered that the defeat of the USSR would mark the defeat of communism and the victory of liberalism. 30 years later, many believe that by putting limits to Russia, the West would allow its liberal model to score a touchdown. Then it is also important to keep in mind how the system of international relations seems to be transiting again. Russian President Vladimir Putin is perceived as a serious threat to liberal values, but Russia is also seen together with China as an obstacle for the preservation of the American domination of the world's perspectives. Back in the 1990s, after the USSR crumbled, the US rose as the world's only superpower. But today, at a moment when the balance of power is determined by both conventional and unconventional warfare, Washington fears that it could lose its top position to Moscow and Beijing. Many countries engaged in Ukraine read the situation as if the winner would take it all. Somewhere, this is the rule of geopolitics. But Ukraine is also there to remind us that some traditional concepts keep relevant. Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz said in the early 19th century that war was, according to him, the continuation of policy with other means. War is indeed a way for countries engaged over Ukraine to try and have their claims consolidated by force if needed. Obviously, not all diplomatic channels have been explored before the war. Some talks were organized, but abrupt evolutions were quick in prevailing. That said, for liberals who believed that the era of cooperation and consensus would end up prevailing, Ukraine came as a contradiction. The 21st century is only at the beginning, and it is full of examples of wars that were meant to remain part of the past. Then, when it comes to the view from Brussels, Ukraine is in Europe, but it is not in the European Union. Nor is Ukraine part of NATO, which is a body created at the beginning of the Cold War to counter the USSR's influence at that time. It may be one of the EU members' dearest wishes to have Ukraine joining them as a new member. The same goes for NATO members, especially since the majority of NATO countries are part of the EU. But this same wish is part of the problem, and this leads to the following. The EU, or at least some of its members, may be a bit hasty in considering extending borders and having more countries joining them institutionally speaking. Back in the 1990s, former President of the European Commission, Jacques Delors, had warned of the fact that an accelerated enlargement of the EU towards the East would take the risk of altering many of the foundations that the European project had been building on over decades. From Jacques Delors' point of view, it was better to wait for new potential members to develop further their economy, institutions, and infrastructures before they could join the EU. With the sudden enlargement of the EU to the east in 2004, Europeans accentuated further the impression that there would be a two-speed EU. Today, we are even closer to a two-mentalities EU, as rendered evident, for example, by the issues that are surrounding the rule of law and its evolutions in Poland and Hungary. By accepting Ukraine's adhesion to the EU, Europeans would also have to explain to unsuccessful candidates such as Albania and Turkey what the European future holds for them. The EU needs to be coherent if it wants to be convincing and respected. Ukraine has also given NATO a new reason to think of its own identity. Back in the 1990s, after the USSR went down, NATO wondered what its own future would look like. The result was that it got involved in many post-Cold War conflict scenes, claiming that it was acting for pacification purpose and state-building consolidation. But the fact is that NATO is also a club of countries that believe that liberal regimes need to be defended by the use of military force if needed. Through Ukraine, NATO may extend to 2 other new members at least, but extension will also rhyme with tension, as Russia fears the scenario of having NATO members have their missiles directed towards its territory. Part of the explanations for Ukraine's war lie in this fact. But we're forgetting about Ukraine's own contradictions. The fact that the majority of Ukrainians oppose Russia and its attitude towards their country makes little to no doubt. But this does not mean that Ukrainians are necessarily unanimous in their opposition to Russia. There are no clear indications about the exact number of Ukrainians who fully support Moscow, though most indications tend towards saying that around 20% of Ukrainians were favorable to Russia previously to 2022. Those people seem to be concentrated geographically in the eastern part of the country, but this does not make them less important. It's rather the contrary. Looking at Ukraine implies acknowledging that the population is divided over certain matters, some of them relating to whether they should join officially the Western Bloc or not. Finally, when it comes to the human dimension, there is no doubt that we are facing a tragedy in Ukraine. Ukrainians are escaping a war situation with heavy shelling and bombings, and one can only be proud seeing that the governments and the public opinions of the EU are helping and assisting them. Things could not go any other way, and it is even fair to add that Europeans have been more generous towards Ukrainians than Americans, for example, have been. But we shouldn't forget, at the same time, that what is ongoing is a war in which many sides are engaged, way beyond Russians and Ukrainians. Russia is bombing places in Ukraine, and it is blocking economic and commercial perspectives. That's for sure. But on the other side, to date, there are at least 23 countries that are supplying the government of Ukraine with military material and ammunitions, the majority of these countries being part of the EU. So whether the Ukraine conflict keeps active or a solution is reached depends on protagonists and whether they would be ready to discuss their divergences concretely or keep engaged in what sounds, in part at least, as a war of attrition where the civil population is paying the major price. In other words, it is high time to get back to diplomacy. We may not like Putin, but peace precisely can only be negotiated between enemies. And for them to agree on solutions, they need to be sitting in front of each other at the same level. The price for peace in Ukraine will necessarily be high, but acceptable as opposed to a war of attrition that international citizens, starting with Ukrainians, are paying the price for.